The concept of a hybrid real estate professional is someone who leverages the skills, knowledge, and income from one other chapter of their life and parlays it into being a real estate investor. When I was starting, I didn't have any community. I didn't do coaching or anything like that. But now I just am a true believer in the value of that. If you go through something tough or unforeseen and it's really stressful, if you try and internalize all that stress, it's going to eat you alive. But if you have a vehicle or either a coach or a community or other investors that you can talk to and work through that stuff with, it feels 1,000 pounds lighter. And you're much more likely to come out of that, maybe even in a better position.
Do you mind sharing us a little bit about your background and what initially got you involved in the real estate space?
My parents were real estate investors, very similar archetype. They had young kids. They both worked full-time at a prominent tech company. They worked 50, 60 hours at their day jobs, and they built a portfolio of rentals on the side. I'd be lying if I said I was paying close attention when I was growing up, because I wasn't, but I grew up around it. And as I got further into my adult life, as you start to plan for your future and think about raising a family and your financial future, the idea entered my mind of real estate investing could be a good way to.
Some spouses take a little more convincing when it comes to the risk affiliated or associated with real estate investing. And it sounds like she already had an entrepreneurial spirit in her.
When we met, she was in a PhD program and she was taking, it could be considered a linear path towards very stable employment. But as we met and got to know each other and kind of traveled through life together, before real estate, I was always the guy who would come up with business ideas all the time, and she would engage in those conversations. But I think that spirit developed in her over time. And now it's she's fully embraced it. But now she's really engaged and bought into what our real estate business can do for our family over the long term. Welcome to the Hybrid Real Estate Professional Podcast, the show where we help you build your own portfolio of cash flowing rental properties that you can manage in just 20 minutes per day from anywhere in the world. I am your host, Aaron Amin. My wife and I built a portfolio of 8 cash flowing rental properties across 3 states in 3 years, all while working full-time and starting a family of 3 young kids. Today's episode features me being interviewed by my friends Anna Bialek and Nico Garcia on the Agent to Investor podcast. It's always fun to jump on the other side of the mic. We talked about the original reason I got into real estate, the influence my parents' investing journey had on my own, and some of the most important tips and tricks I've picked up along the way as a remote real estate investor. Quick shout out to Anna and Nico for letting me reuse this footage. Be sure to go check out their show, the Agent to Investor podcast, if you haven't already. All right, let's get into it.
Welcome to episode 28 of the Agent to Investor podcast, where we talk about the agent side of real estate investing. We'll be talking about the successes, the failures, and all in between. My name is Nico Garcia. I'm a local real estate investor and agent based out of Montgomery County, Maryland. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host,
Anna Bialek, Northern Virginia realtor and mostly out-of-state investor.
And we have a wonderful guest today, one of our good friends, Mr. Aaron Amin. Welcome, Aaron. How are you today? And thanks for coming on.
I'm doing great. Thank you guys both for having me on. I'm excited to share some of my story and hopefully give some value to your audience.
Yeah, we are super excited. You have a really cool story. And those of you who don't know Aaron, he is a real estate investor. He is a W-2 employee. He is a podcast host. He hosts the Hybrid Real Estate Professional podcast. He is also a coach in the real estate space. And most importantly, he's a husband and father of 3. So we'll just dive right in. Aaron, you mind sharing us a little bit about your background and where you come from and what initially got you involved in the real estate space?
Sure. Well, I think you hit the headlines really well. Thank you for teeing that up for me. Yeah, so I'm Aaron Amin. I am based in Houston, Texas with my wife and my 3 young children. We got a 3-year-old daughter and twins, identical twin boys that are about to turn 1 in a few weeks as of the time of this recording. So we've got our hands full here at home, but a house full of love and in a beautifully chaotic chapter of our lives. So why not on top of that, we just decide to have a full-time job as a consultant. So I work fully remotely, but I go on contract at different companies as needed. And we are also real estate investors across 3 different states. So we built a portfolio of 8 single-family long-term rentals across Nevada, Washington, and Iowa. And we did that kind of over the course of a few years, all while we were moving around the country and building our family. Through those experiences, we gained some battle scars and learned some tough lessons and made some, what I'd like to think are avoidable mistakes. And that spawned the desire to start coaching other people and trying to, kind of document some of the things that we could have done better, turned it into a more like linear success path that we can pay it forward to the next generation of people who want to get into investing. So that's kind of at a high level. We learned by doing and then turned it into something that we can pay forward to other investors. There's a lot more within that story too, because the whole time I have been working full time, we had 3 kids in a very short period of time. And that really changed the game for us. A lot of the stuff that we were doing leading up to that, we've had to change and refactor since then. So how do I actually get into real estate investing? So this is a little more complicated of an answer, but basically I grew up around it. So my parents were real estate investors, very similar archetype. They had young kids. They both worked full time at a prominent tech company. They worked 50, 60 hours at their day jobs, and they built a portfolio of rentals on the side. I'd be lying if I said I was paying close attention when I was growing up, because I wasn't, but I grew up around it. And as I got further into my adult life, as you start to plan for your future and think about raising a family and your financial future, the idea entered my mind of real estate investing could be a good way to supplement what I'm doing with my day job. So we learned some of the fundamentals from them, but ultimately we also learned just by doing. And we bought a rental kind of down the street from where we lived in Las Vegas at the time. And from there, everything just evolved naturally. I'm going to pause there though, because there's a lot we can peel back, but that's the origin story and the high level.
Interesting. Would you say I always go off script. I don't know if Nico warned you about that. So you said you were around it growing up and now you're a coach of real estate investing. Would you say that growing up with it made it, I'll say, less scary or easier to dive right in? Because as someone who started and wasn't necessarily growing up with it, it's very scary to even consider real estate investing. Most people they think it's for rich people. I'll say it.
Yeah, I love this question. And so what's really interesting about the timing of when my parents started investing is in the early 2000s, we were living in San Diego and they bought a primary house and a few rentals. So I think they had 3 rentals total. We all know what happened in the early 2000s. And so everything was just riding high, groovy. Values were going up like crazy. There were cash flowing rentals and everyone was feeling on top of the world. We, as a family, relocated to East Tennessee, which is where my mom is from, in 2007. And they decided to exchange the 3 rentals and the primary home that they had in San Diego for 13 rentals in Knoxville, Tennessee. And my stepdad at the time, he decided he was going to go full time into real estate and he wanted to do property management. They were going to do the whole real estate professional thing, similar stuff to what we all talk about in our communities these days. But they weren't part of communities or masterminds or anything. There was no bigger pockets that I'm aware of at the time. And so they did a lot of this. They blazed this trail themselves all while they were working full time. But we all know that the timing around then, so many things out of their control. Unfortunately, things bottomed out right after they had moved out of this really nice, stable California market that is just known as this kind of paradise and permanent appreciation market into this cash flow market in Knoxville. And the bottom kind of fell out from under them and it totally refactored. They were on track to semi-retire and ultimately probably permanently retire, but the economy had different plans for them. So I watched them kind of go through this and they basically got caught holding the bag with all those rentals. They could have sold them at a significant loss or hold on to them, which is what they chose to do. But there were all sorts of economic challenges too. Like the tenants that they had in there were facing their own struggles. So they had a lot of non-payment. They had just a really tough time with those rentals. And with 13 rentals, we own 8. So we've seen one phrase that a friend of mine said when I told him I own 8 rentals, he said, that's a lot of appliances. It's a lot of roofs, right? And it's true, right? If you have 13 rentals at any given moment, something could be going wrong. Mm-hmm. And especially in an economic troubling period like that. So anyway, long story short, I watched them weather this storm and I saw a lot of the stress that they went through. But I watched them stay the course. Some of that was because they had the ability to go get a W-2 job again, and they were able to endure it using other skills and income in their life. And they made it out without having to sell at a big loss and book a big loss. So I observed the prosperity and I observed the difficult times. Again, I was younger, so I wouldn't say I was like watching everything they were doing, but I remember what it felt like to watch them go through these different chapters. And they've really came out of that strong. And now they were able to sell off that portfolio and exchange it for properties in Washington State, which is where they live now. They were both able to retire early, partially because of real estate, but partially because they were dedicated in their careers, kind of by osmosis absorbed a lot of their playbook, and they had the jobs, they had the kids, and they had the real estate, and they had the resilience. And so I would say that made a big impression on me, both in a good and watching them go through the challenges. That really helped propel and prepare us for what it would be like to be real estate investors ourselves.
That's a super cool story because I think that also taught you not just resilience, but it sounds like probably, I'll say, somewhat calculated risk, because like my brother-in-law was in real estate before and he lost his shirt, and he's one that now is like, you guys are doing that? Like, that's bad. That's super scary. And some people did not fare as well, but it sounds like you learned how to do calculated risks through them too, because they clearly didn't put all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
And they didn't panic. I think that was the big takeaway for me during the recession years, because I was college age during that period, and I wasn't thinking about real estate really, but it was a simple enough concept to me that if their properties went down 30% in value and they sold them, that would have been a really bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so I watched them kind of problem solve their way out of it and not make rash decisions or panic or do something that could have put them back. If they had done that, it could have wiped 5 years off of the timeline for retirement for them. So watching them kind of go through that and overcome it and then turn it into an opportunity in the future, that taught me a lesson or two. What I will say about it though is that when I started investing, I already knew that it was a matter of if not when something crazy would happen. So if I wanted, in my late 20s when I started investing, I knew that if I want to do this for 20 or 30 years, there will be crazy things that happen. And so even it gives you a little perspective to enjoy when things are going smooth, but not expect it to stay that way. And if that's going to be a problem, or if you are going to expect it to constantly be going well, you're going to set yourself up for disappointment. So I think it, at a minimum of their experiences, armed you with the perspective to know that there will be crazy times and you can get through them. Those two things helped me get started with proper expectations.
Yeah, 100%. We had Coach Carson on last week talking about that time during the financial crisis and here. And those who did weather the storm in the investing game learned a ton. Obviously, they had a few setbacks. They pivoted. And those who actually were able to continue investing are the ones that really have become successful. So I just wanted to circle back to your background, Aaron, because I saw in an interview you discussing your previous employee. I know now you work a fully hybrid and you work as a consultant, but before that, when you initially got involved, what was it that you were doing? And I know it was pretty like a high demanding job that you were doing.
Yeah, so I'll give a little lineage of my career. So I'm a musician. I've played drums since I was 10 years old, very passionate about music. For a long time, that's what I was convinced I was going to do. When I started college, I started as a percussion major. I was in marching band. I was in different rock bands. And so all the while I was going through school, I was networking within the music industry and playing shows and just participating in every way I possibly could within the music industry. Ultimately, I ended up graduating with a business degree because I realized that a percussion degree doesn't really arm you with any income producing skills that you can't gain on your own. If you want to be a good drummer, you just need to practice and become a good drummer. So I shifted from being a performer into actually kind of making my way into the music industry. So what was happening is I was playing all these shows and I was meeting people at all these different venues. And I started befriending the bookers and the marketers and the people that actually produced the shows. And so it led me to a career as a concert promoter. And so the first 10 years of my professional career, I worked at small rock clubs all the way up to one of the largest entertainment companies, actually the largest entertainment company in the world. And my job was basically, so what a booker does in concerts is they're the ones that negotiate the deals with the artists' agents. The agent will come through and say, hey, we have so-and-so band coming through town. Here's approximately what we're charging for tickets somewhere. And here's what we want to get paid. And then our office would have to go through and calculate, what can we pay them? How many tickets do we think they can sell? And then how can we budget to produce this show? The reason I'm getting all granular like that is because a lot of the mechanics of that are really parallel to how you approach real estate too, right? Is like you have or really any type of business. You have your income, you have a line item of expenses that you need to understand inside and out. And then you need to understand the demand of how much you can really sell. And so I spent a lot of time. So my lifestyle at that time was like 5 days in the office, full time, answering phones. I always joked, if you've seen Entourage, it's not quite that dramatic, but the phone's ringing all the time. You're screening phones for your boss. You're getting yelled at times, and it's very fast paced, very intense, and lots of egos. So I had this very high pressure environment where we were putting on shows all the time. And then when I wasn't in the office, I was going to shows 3 or 4 nights a week. And over time, I lived in Seattle at the time, but I ended up moving to Las Vegas. Vegas, as we know, is a beautiful place, but it has many temptations and lots of action. And so the concerts industry plus Vegas, plus being in my 20s, working 60, 70 hours a week, led me to a high pressure lifestyle. I had plenty of fun until I didn't. And basically what happened is I was running myself ragged. I take full responsibility for this, right? But as I kept going to shows, as I kept leaning into this career, trying to grow, trying to advance, very competitive industry, I ultimately just fell into my vices. And in May 2nd, 2019, I checked myself into an inpatient rehab voluntarily, but basically I didn't like the direction my life was going. I couldn't see a path forward. I wasn't making as much money as I would like to make. I was working 3 or 4 times as hard as it felt that I could sustain. And so that was really a turnaround point for me, where I started to ask a lot of questions. First of all, I had to do a ton of inner work to deal with what was causing me to behave like that. But second, I had to ask myself what we want our future to look like. I had just gotten married to my wife earlier in 2018. We knew we wanted kids, and I just could not see a path forward in that career path where we were able to have a balanced, meaningful life, where we were able to hit our financial objectives and have the lifestyle that we want if I stayed on that path. So real estate became an answer to that when we started thinking, okay, what is something that you can put time and energy into that has the potential to grow? There's not only leverage on your money, but there's leverage on your time. You don't need 40 to 60 hours a week in real estate to make an investment that can have outsized returns over a long period of time. You own all that upside. And so I started thinking back and recalling a lot of that experience from my parents that I just described earlier. And it kind of became an obvious answer of, okay, I can continue to work my job, but if all I do is go work a job where I feel like I'm underpaid and overworked, there's no path forward where I'm going to come out ahead or on top or in control of our finances. There has to be something else that goes in tandem with that. So that career path and those experiences, I learned more in those 10 years than I probably could have in just about any other path. I learned how to operate with urgency. I learned how to know numbers inside and out, learned how to negotiate. I learned how to deal with people's egos and personalities. And all of those things armed me with a very parallel skill set that have made me find some degree of success in real estate. So I'm grateful for that time period, but it certainly, I came out with some scars and hopefully better off as a result.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. That's a very important story. You learn all these things through kind of just trial and error and learning kind of as you go. And I know you just mentioned you were married right before you went into the rehab. How important was having a partner that was supportive of you and understood your journey? How important was that for moving forward and eventually to where you are now?
Yeah. I mean, whether it's a friend or a partner for life, like having somebody that's in your corner that's going to unconditionally support you and understand what you're going through and sympathize. People that struggle with addiction, oftentimes their behavior is not the greatest before they clean their act up. And I'll readily admit I was very difficult to deal with in the days leading up to that. And I am infinitely, eternally grateful for not only my wife, but my family and those who supported me. And they knew who I was as a person. They knew my intentions, and they just wanted to see me feel better and get better. And so, yeah, my wife and I, a lot of this was grounded in our vision of like, hey, you're headed on the wrong track. If we continue doing what we're doing, it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So what can we do to make that better? A lot of it was on me. I had to do that inner work. I had to self-reflect and make sure that I truly believed in the decision I was making. Again, I know this isn't an addiction podcast, but addiction is something where if you can't acknowledge it head on, admit it and realize that you've lost control, you're never going to really be able to turn the corner. So that was a really critical period of my life. I'm grateful I had the space, even my employer. So believe it or not, in the music industry, addiction grows on trees. And so it is not uncommon for people to deal with this. So even though a lot of the behavior spawned from that line of work, they were also supportive. And I was not the first person in my line of work to go through something like this. It happens pretty commonly. So I had the support I needed, and I'm grateful that gave me the perspective. Do I wish I could have avoided some of the behavior and the things that led up to that? Maybe, but I also know that it's a part of my story, and we wouldn't be where we are right now had that not happened.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. It reminds me of, if you've been living under a rock, Layla Hermosi talks all openly about her struggles with addiction. And she talks about the fact that if you have that type of personality, it doesn't ever truly go away, but it's learning to do the inner work to refocus that energy, that addictive personality towards something constructive and something that will make your life better versus making it worse. And that sounds like what you were able to do with your support network and the vision that you cast with your wife.
Yeah, you don't shed the addictive personality ever. That's a really good way to put it. And I often say that too. It's like I had a ton of misdirected energy. I was channeling it towards my vices, towards this growing resentment, towards my career that I was never going to move forward. And resentment is a big compounding force too, right? The more you start to think about all the ways that you feel that you've been wronged, the more that behavior just continues to grow and spiral. So you take all that energy, because there's a ton of it, and you redirect it towards something positive, then yeah, there's a reason that a lot of people that have struggled with addiction go on to become extremely successful entrepreneurs. Because if they can channel that same type of energy and put it in the right direction, they have that addictive tendency to put themselves towards it, and generally a lot of determination to succeed. But it is interesting that entrepreneurs in general are much more prone to addiction than most other career paths. I believe that's been studied and reviewed by many different psychologists, and there's a lot of sources that say that entrepreneurship and addiction go hand in hand. So
Yeah.
again, I'm grateful for the perspective that it gave me. And I'm 5.5 years sober at the time of this recording, and nothing has been other than getting married to my wife, who we've built a beautiful life together. There's no other singular decision that's had a larger impact on my life than deciding to clean my act up.
That's awesome. So we'll get back to the real estate investing. I just wanted to touch on that because I feel like anyone that's listening to this that struggles with that, like this gives them hope to know that you can pivot. And now we can talk about all the amazing things that you have done by focusing that energy into real estate investing.
So Aaron, with going back and to your beginning stages, I think I heard you on an interview talk about trying to decide whether you wanted a big wedding or saving up that money for a down payment. Jessica, my fiance, and I are actually having the same conversation. And as a man, you want to provide your partner with the type of wedding that they've always dreamed of, but you also want to be financially free in 10 years, and you understand the power of real estate. It's one of the reasons why I wanted her to come to BPCon last month, is to just understand that there's different avenues and we're choosing the house hacking route. But just going off of your initial stages and those conversations that you had with your now wife, how difficult was it? And how did it look when you decided you guys wanted to go into real estate investing?
Yeah, sorry, I want to make sure I understand the question. Is it about the wedding or the real estate?
I think you ended up having a wedding in your backyard and using that money for investing, correct?
So was it getting her on board? I think the question is more about like getting her on board. Like, I don't know if she had real estate experience before. Was she pretty open to this once you brought this to the table?
Yeah, so I think, a couple things there I'll address. One is that the idea of a wedding, and we had been together for 7 years already by the time we decided to get married. And we already were operating like we were married. Everything we were doing was in tandem. We were in sync on all of our decisions, all of our finances. We made decisions together. There was no operating separately. And the idea of beating around the bush about, do we get engaged and have this long drawn out process that then the next year or so becomes about this wedding, which then kind of puts any other type of goals on pause. I was still working in the music industry at this time. So keep in mind, most of my energy and time was going towards this 60, 70 hours a week of just running and gunning in the music industry. So I wasn't very present anyway. So the idea of throwing a wedding on top of that, and then the expectations that come with that and the expense that comes with that, it felt overwhelming, and it would be difficult for us to live up to those expectations. We were living in a city where none of our family was based. We had friends there, but we had a lot of friends elsewhere. And so the decision was just, hey, if we do a traditional wedding and we take the time and the energy and spend the money that it takes to do that, that's a huge investment of time and money that we just don't know if we'll even be able to clear the bar of what our expectations would be. So at the end of the day, one of the benefits of being in Vegas, you can get married within an hour or two if you really want to. So actually, a funny story about Elvis, right? So we called the minister, and because you can literally call a minister and they'll be over at your house in a couple hours. And he did offer us the Elvis upsell package because he keeps his Elvis suit in the trunk, of course, but we did not pay for the Elvis upsell. We did not see the ROI on that. But our entire wedding was $150 for the court filing fee and $75 for the minister. He came and we just knocked it out. We weren't prepared in any way, shape, or form. We didn't have rings. We didn't have vows, but we allowed that moment to just be about ourselves and not the expectations that would have been set around the wedding. So anyway, that's I just want to encapsulate the nature of that decision. And then with that freedom, once we were married, we felt like we could really just immediately shift gears and focus to the life we wanted to build together. One of the components of that was the sobriety piece that I mentioned. But the second was that we knew we wanted to have kids. We knew we wanted to lay some financial foundation. And we knew that our careers and the money that we were making was not going to do that unless something changed. So when it came time to decide whether to invest in real estate or not, the upside of that idea was compelling enough that even though she didn't have the same background or exposure to it that I did with my family, she was incredibly open to the idea. And it is something that we have done together since the very beginning. A lot of learning by doing, but from that first property on, that's a decision that we both were engaged in from the beginning.
That's awesome. Some spouses take a little more convincing when it comes to the risks affiliated or associated with real estate investing. And it sounds like either you explained it really well or she already had an entrepreneurial spirit in her before you.
It's interesting because I wouldn't say she had that in her before. When we met, she was in a PhD program and she was taking what it could be considered a linear path towards very stable employment. But as we met and got to know each other and traveled through life together, I think I have always had that entrepreneurial spirit. And so just by engaging in conversations and talking through different ideas, and before real estate, I was always the guy who would come up with business ideas all the time. And she would either humor me or at least she would engage in those conversations. But I think that spirit developed in her over time. And now it's she's fully embraced it. And we can talk about some of what we're doing, today.
Yeah.
Once we get there. But now she's really engaged and bought into what our real estate business can do for our family over the long term.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing about your background. And I think it's a very unique story. So what we're going to do now is take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about your current portfolio. And we're going to talk about our main topic, which is out-of-state investing. So stay tuned.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Remote Real Estate Academy, the community I launched last year where I personally coach investors and empower them to buy rental properties anywhere in the United States. My business partner Nathan and I have a collective 15 years experience with over 20 cash flowing out-of-state rental properties. We provide a step-by-step playbook on how you can build your own portfolio and start accessing the life-changing benefits of real estate investing starting today. Go to remoterealestateacademy.com for more info, or better yet, shoot me an email at aaron@aaronamin.com with subject line RREA, and I'll throw in a special bonus for podcast listeners who join the Academy. Now let's get to the show.
And we are back. And now we're going to talk to Aaron about his current portfolio and how he's managing his properties from afar. I know we talked a little bit about when you started and you're currently living in Texas, but where was it when you initially got started, and where did you purchase your first property, and how's your portfolio look now?
Yeah. So I know we spent a lot of time on the origin story, so I'll try and speed it up a little bit and retrace our journey between then and now. But we lived in Las Vegas from 2015 to 2019. We bought our first primary house in 2017 in a nice neighborhood near downtown Las Vegas. It was an interesting place because 10 years prior, I think people didn't even want to walk in that neighborhood. They viewed it as dangerous and seedy. Vegas was hit one of the hardest in the recession out of anywhere in the country. But it had started to recover. And when we moved into that neighborhood, there were dumpsters outside on a lot of houses, and it was starting to flip over and gentrify. So we decided when we bought our first rental in 2019 that we would do it just in that same neighborhood. So it was the opposite of long distance investing. It was about a mile from our primary house. That was an experiment. Like we said earlier, we saved a bunch of money from not doing an expensive wedding. So we put a higher down payment on that first rental, bought our way into some cash flow. I didn't know how to analyze a deal at all. All I knew is that if the rent was higher than the mortgage, that was a good thing. None of the fundamentals that I use today to analyze deals or neighborhoods or anything, we didn't apply any of that. We bought something that looked good down the street from where we lived, figuring that we could solve whatever problems may come up. I leaned heavily on my parents. They were the only real people they were the only other investors we knew. We weren't part of any communities, no books, no podcasts, nothing. So that first one was really risk averse, if you will. But the agent who sold us that house, he called us a few months later And he said, hey, I have these 2 properties off market. They're operating as assisted living homes for adults with developmental disabilities. He said, the owner's willing to sell them. Here's the price. They're on 5-year leases. They're paying 40% above market rent, and they plan to stay there forever if you'll let them. So, wow, that's unbelievable, right? We have these 2 houses that are basically on commercial leases, paying significantly above what the market could get if we were to rent them out to families. So we went from having one very straight ahead single family long-term rental to getting I don't know how we were lucky enough to get that phone call, but basically we had to figure out how to afford those 2 houses because that was a life-changing opportunity. So we ended up doing a cash out refi on our primary house. We ended up basically dumping out every piggy bank we had across our stock portfolio to get into those 2 deals. What started as an experiment with that first long-term rental became an identity shift. We went from having, no rentals to 3 rentals in about 6 months. That's where that addictive personality comes in. Fell in love with the process, right? I fell in love with the feeling of locking in deals. I took all those parallels from my music industry career, and I love getting deep into the numbers, and I started to really understand the impact and the power of this type of investing. And so from there, we had 4 houses in Las Vegas. Then COVID hit very shortly after. And the unemployment in Vegas peaked around 26%. The national average was 14%. That city is basically built on hospitality, entertainment, and gaming, not being video gaming, being gambling, right?
Yeah.
And the strip shut down for about a little over 2 months. And so basically we had to decide, like my job was furloughed immediately. And I had to decide if I was going to wait it out and stay in Vegas or go find another job when there's tens of millions of people unemployed. Long story short, we decided to move back to Seattle, where most of my professional network was. That's where I grew up. And so we had this decision to make. Okay, we did this safe thing. We invested in our backyard. We were self-managing it because it was close by. We were just doing it all ourselves. And we said, crap, like we're about to be 1,100 miles away. What do we do? Do we sell all these things? Like, how do we do it? No network, no other investors, no, communities. So we basically decided when we moved that we were going to figure out how to do it long distance. We said it's not a good decision if we sell all these properties. If we sold all 4 of those properties, we might have been able to buy 1 in Seattle. And that just didn't sound smart. So we had a good friend of ours that we paid a retainer to be our first line of defense. So if the tenants had a call or an issue, he would drive over and check them out. But we self-managed. We did all the paperwork, lease renewal, tenant communications, stuff like that. And so we basically built our own little self-management system in Vegas. And lo and behold, a couple of years went by, nothing broke. So we realized like, hey, this long distance thing is possible. We did not do it the most efficient or smart way. There are definitely better ways to do it than what we did at first. So again, the avoidable mistakes, they were definitely there. But I did run an analysis a couple of years later, and like we saved over 5 years, we saved about $30,000 in property management fees by doing it the way we did it. Take that for what it's worth. But anyway, that was our proof of concept of how long distance could work. We ended up buying 2 properties while we lived in Washington State. Those we ended up partnering with my parents on. So they put up the down payment money, and then we split the cash flow. One of them was a house hack. So it had 2 units. We bought it as a primary and then ended up renting out both units. And the other one was almost an accident. We had every intention of living in Washington for the long term. Like I mentioned at the top, we had 3 kids in about 2 years. And so a lot of stuff changed very quickly, especially when we found out we were having twins. So one of the houses that we had in Washington was meant to be our primary, but we decided to move to Texas to account for basically the cost of living. It was going to cost about $7,000 a month to put 3 kids in daycare in Washington. And in Houston, where we live now, it's about $3,000. So that's a story for another day, but basically our whole financial situation got flipped overnight and we had some tough decisions to make. So we bought those 2 in Washington. And then the only market that we did truly long distance, like sight unseen, never been there, is an area called the Quad Cities in Iowa. And that was where we had built up some courage by doing the long distance thing in Vegas. At that point, we had 6 houses in Washington, between Washington and Vegas. And we felt we had enough experience that we could try this experiment of purely long distance investing. It was 2021, so values had skyrocketed across the country. There was nothing affordable in Vegas. There was nothing affordable in Washington. So the only way we could continue to invest was finding a different market. If any out-of-state investors here know that a lot of the flyover markets in the Midwest and the South, like that's where you can still find deals, even in today's environment. And so we did a bunch of research and we looked at several different markets. We did it purely academically. Like we did the top-down market analysis, the macro trends, the rent to price ratio, almost like a spreadsheet style analysis, which is very different than how we started. And it became this big experiment. We ended up buying 3 houses in the Quad Cities in 2022. I don't know. Maybe I'll pause there and see if you want to take it anywhere, but that's the construction of our portfolio. We had 8 houses across 3 states in 3 years.
Wow, that's a lot. So I have a question. So obviously you started out your portfolio in places you were living, with the exception of Iowa, and you did this huge analysis. What were I don't know, the top, I'll say 2 or 3 factors that made you decide to stick with that? I know you did the overall analysis, but what 3 things were you really looking at to decide this is where we're going to invest?
Yeah. So one of the benefits I guess we had was that we already owned 6 properties and they were in markets that had strong appreciation. So we feel like we had that bucket filled. Like we had our appreciation properties. They were all cash flowing. They were bought with cheap debt, things that arguably you can't really recreate, right? I don't take credit for that. We were in the right place at the right time and we took action instead of waiting. That's the only thing I'll take credit for is obviously the longer you wait. And if you're thinking about doing something, stuff tends to run away with values and whatnot. But basically, because we already had properties that fit that profile in markets that fit that appreciation profile, we wanted a diversification against that. So in 2021 and 2022, Vegas went up and then back down. Washington did something similar. We were looking for markets that didn't have a big correlation to the overall market, that were just going to be slow and steady and stable. 2 to 3% appreciation per year sounded great. As long as it doesn't go up 10% and down 6% and up 20%, down 30%. Like we didn't want a roller coaster. If we wanted that, we would just invest in the stock market. So ability was one of them. Risk to rent ratio was one of them. So we knew we had a few down payments worth of money that we might be able to do over the course of that year. We had our daughter in 2021. So like our finances were already starting to change. So what we were trying to do is find additional cash flow so that when my wife took time off work, we had something we could at least supplement. It wasn't going to replace her salary, but ultimately we ended up getting our net cash flow up to about $5,000 a month. I'm talking net, not gross. So that was after we had our CapEx and vacancy and maintenance and management and everything else backed out. So, I mean, that is almost a salary's worth of income that we could tap into. Previously, we had been snowballing that and using it to invest forward, but we wanted a couple more that we could get $300 to $400 a month in net cash flow out of. So it was really pretty strictly geared towards cash flow. It wasn't thinking, oh, the Quad Cities is going to be the next San Francisco.
Yeah.
Wasn't anything like that. It was just, how can we diversify away from some of these more volatile markets, find somewhere that's going to be pretty stable in the face of these big macroeconomic developments, and then ultimately a team too. But there's a story behind that because we've had some turnover in our team over the 2.5 years we've been in Iowa as well.
For the investors that are thinking about investing out of state and never have, like you said, stability, but what did you look at specifically? Was it population growth? Did you look to see, I don't know, was Starbucks opening up a place there? Are there any key indicators that you would say you looked at that a new investor could look at to try to narrow down a market?
So there's what I did, and then there's what I would suggest after learning what I learned from what I did. But I would say the indicators, like you said, so population growth is for sure one to pay attention to. If you can go into a market where there's houses for $60,000 that might rent for $800 a month, but if it's in a declining part of town or a declining overall city, that's a pretty easy argument that's not going to probably hold its value very well over time. So that's one trap that I think a lot of people fall into, is if you're only looking at cash flow and you're only looking at those indicators, you're going to miss the bigger picture. So that's one thing I feel like we did right, is this area had in the 80s and the early to mid 80s, there was a pullback in some of the manufacturing jobs that were in this area, but it had been steadily increasing, slowly but surely, population increase over the last couple of decades. I do think also you have to be careful if you only look at trends from 2020 to 2023.
Yeah.
Those were the weirdest years for people moving back and forth. A lot of people were moving from the coastal markets back to their hometowns for a couple of years to work remotely, and now they're back. And so you have to zoom out a bit and make sure you're getting a real accurate representation of what the markets look like. So yeah, population growth, the median income. There were some median income compared to the rents, and just overall, like what are the different industries. So like I mentioned earlier, Vegas is incredibly over-indexed on hospitality, gaming, and entertainment. If an entire city is built on a narrow slice of industry, that's something you have to consider too, because they can live or die by what happens. So this area had a few different types of major employers. There were some data centers and kind of ancillary type business units of larger companies, but it wasn't going to be this next hub. So again, it's almost like those things kind of worked to the advantage of what I was looking for, not against it. When a market makes the headlines or it makes one of those bigger pockets lists, it's not too late, but you're going with the herd. And we
Correct.
actually wanted to break away from the herd and go somewhere where we weren't competing with 30 other investors for every single house that came on the market.
Right. I think Anna had one of her markets she was looking at get blown up because it was one of the bigger buckets, cash flow markets. There's also a great software. It's called Bright Investors. So if you're looking at markets, out of state markets, or even your own market, it pulls all this data that Anna and Aaron are talking about to help you analyze it. But so I just wanted to kind of go back. And so I know you mentioned you started investing kind of in your backyard, and then you ended up investing in places where you were living. But that initial agent, that one that got you the first one and got you those 2 off-market deals, how important is it to have an investor-friendly agent? We're the Agent to Investor podcast, and we talk about having an important team. How important was it to get those 2 off-market deals changed really your guys' trajectory in your investing journey, right?
Yeah, it is not an overstatement to say those completely changed our life in pretty much every possible way. And incredible question. I'm glad you asked. Obviously, it fits your guys' show. I think it cannot be overstated how important it is for the agents that you work with to at least have literacy and some sort of ability to understand what it means to be an investor. Because investors look for completely different things. Yes, you value ultimately a lot of the same features. You want a house to be durable. You want it to be built well. You don't want it to be completely cutting corners or anything like that. But a family with young children that's looking for their forever home is looking for different set of features and is thinking about things and making decisions from a different place than an investor who is trying to optimize. Obviously, not all investors are created equal, but like we want to provide a good living environment, a comfortable place for people to call home, but we don't necessarily need the most expensive frills and features and material types in our rentals. That's not what those are built for. People, when they find their forever home, they go and end up in places like that. But for a rental property, it's different features. So having somebody that could understand that was really important. I will say that the 2 in Iowa and in Vegas, we did something that I would not recommend doing, which is we used Zillow and basically spun the wheel, right? Like in Zillow, I know a lot of people, agents, they can buy their way into leads. And so in some cases, we just got really lucky with our agent there. We were just in Vegas this past weekend and we saw him and we went by the original house that he helped us buy. And we got to thank him because it was such an impactful thing that he helped us navigate. At that time, we didn't know anything other than what I had been asked my parents about. And he educated us too. Like he taught us the different types of mortgages and how insurance was different and like really basic stuff. But he was patient and he was understanding and he bought into our journey. And that's why he ultimately called us a few months later with those deals, is because he said, "Hey, I see what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
I support it. I appreciate it. I know you're going to work hard and that you would not take this opportunity for granted." And so I think that there's something to be said there. And then on the flip side, in Iowa, we did the same thing where we, instead of using networks and talking to other investors first, and this will parlay into some of the mistakes we made, we used Zillow to find an agent again. And I think the mistake I made was I asked the interview questions that I would ask to any agent to see if they're a good fit. And I think I convinced myself that I was hearing just what I
What you
wanted to
wanted to
hear
hear.
versus what I actually heard. And so I had this whole list of stuff that I knew, first of all, blew past the most obvious red flag that she wasn't an investor herself, but she knew how to answer the basic questions around different types of properties and whatnot. And we also felt like we were doing all the research. We just needed somebody to help us. I would say very much that is not the case anymore. I disagree. If you're going to hire an agent and work with an agent, they should be bringing a perspective and expertise to the table that you don't have. Otherwise, why are you engaging? So I would not suggest spinning the Zillow wheel. If I had to do it all over again, I would say one of the things that we teach in this coaching program is always try and build relationships with investors and try and
Yep.
get a network, at least one degree of a referral. Always interview multiple people, because we see it time and time again with some of the people I've coached where we suggest they interview 3 agents, a minimum, in a market. And usually like someone will maybe they'll really enjoy the first conversation they have, but then by the time they get through 3, they'll realize maybe that like it's happened multiple times where they get to number 2 or number 3 and like that person has a better connection or a different perspective that speaks to them more. And so it's the same thing when you search for a house. If you just settle for the first one without seeing multiple, you're lacking the perspective and the contrast of what that could be. So I am very adamant now about not doing what we did when we built our initial team, and making sure that there's some check and balance by way of other investors or local communities or people that can provide checks and balances against what the person you're working with might be guiding you toward. Hopefully, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, sure did. Yeah. And that kind of brings us into what you're doing now with your coaching. And you mentioned you're trying to help your members not make the same mistakes that you did and interview multiple agents and things like that. You might talk about your coaching program for out-of-state investing and how you help these new members get over the fear of out-of-state investing. I don't know if they do, but
Yeah, absolutely. I have one business partner, Nathan, and we run the Remote Real Estate Academy. So he has a similar story where he has a family, young kids, full-time job. He lives in the Bay Area and he has about a dozen rentals across St. Louis and Indiana. And so between us, we have 20 plus rentals across 5 states. He's never even visited the markets that he invests in. And that's one difference between us. But we all put our heads together and really kind of dissected the things that we did good and the things that we did not as good, and built out like a pretty linear replica of what it would take to do what we did, but do it faster and with less mistakes. And so we built out a whole course and curriculum. One lucky thing about real estate is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like I would almost challenge if somebody comes with a totally brand new proprietary path on how to become a single family long distance real estate investor, because there's a tried and true path, but a lot of it is about mindset and conquering the fear, taking action, being thorough and deliberate, and knowing what to look for. So we tried to download our perspective and the mistakes that we made and think of, okay, if it was a mistake or something we would have done differently, how can we spin that into a lesson on how to do it? And if there was something that we did really well, then how can we teach that in the most efficient way? And I would say too that a lot of the programs and coaching out there is geared towards this idea of like, how can I quit my job as soon as possible and build this enormous stream of passive income as quickly as possible? And that's not really our message. We're geared towards people that have W-2 jobs. They're not necessarily unhappy with their W-2. Maybe they want to continue to work it for the long run, or at least the next 10 plus years, because they understand what a financial advantage that can be if they do that and have real estate. They want to be present for their families and keep their family at the center of their life, not have it be edged out by yet another side hustle. And so a lot of what we teach is how to do this in 20 minutes a day or less. So we have this kind of program called the 20-minute investor, where we just show like, hey, if you commit 20 minutes a day, either 5 or 7 days a week, depends on your lifestyle and your constraints. Here's how you can continue to grow and operate a portfolio across from anywhere in the US in a small amount of time. There's some upfront work to build teams and find the right market and build the right systems. But once you kind of build the machine, you can keep it fed and keep it growing using the income from your W-2, the income from your rentals, and the teams and systems that you have in place to keep growing and growing. And so it's really fun because the first chapter of working with someone, you're just teaching them the fundamentals. There's a few resistance points that we see everyone hit. The first one is for sure picking a market. Because if you have this idea that I can invest anywhere in the country, but you pull out a blank map, most people just get stuck staring at, I could invest here, I could invest here, I could invest here. And you just spin in circles because it feels impossible to make a decision. So having a coach or someone that can be a sounding board for you I like this market and this market. And at some point you just need somebody to help you get over the hump and pick something and start, right? So that's a big resistance point. Building a team, right? I think there's some stuff that through experience, I've had to fire multiple property managers. Nathan's also gone through a couple team members, and we've seen what doesn't work. We've seen a lot of the common flags, and we've seen the things that we do that do allow us to do that 20-minute investor routine. And it really, your team is a critical part of being able to do that. So those are just the types of things that we try and help people dial in And I think sometimes it's just helpful to know that there's someone else that uh, you can run your ideas by. We also have a community too. So right now we have 60 members. So there's a lot of peer-to-peer dialogue. Like I mentioned, when I was starting, I didn't have any community. I didn't do coaching or anything like that. But now I just am a true believer in the value of that. I know we're all in a community together too. And just being able to bounce a question, if you go through something tough or unforeseen and it's really stressful, if you try and internalize all that stress, it's going to eat you alive. But if you have a vehicle or either a coach or a community or other investors that you can talk to and work through that stuff with, it feels 1,000 pounds lighter. And you're much more likely to come out of that, maybe even in a better position, right? There's very few bad things that I've gone through in real estate that I haven't come out stronger in the end. And sometimes you just need that perspective to zoom out a bit and realize that those hiccups are just blips on a radar in a much bigger picture. That's, like I said, it's not reinventing the wheel. It's really focused on the idea that you can integrate this into your life without having it take over. We're our own proof of concept. We can build these to this $5,000 a month in net profit income stream while working full time and progressing in your career, while being present husbands and fathers. What we're largely trying to do is just other people who want to follow a similar path. We're there. We make it accessible. It's affordable. And we have a growing community that, this is what we love doing. So it doesn't feel like work. It's really fun to help people kind of chart that path and then continue to grow alongside them.
Yeah. I also find, along with not reinventing the wheel, that's like my favorite catchphrase. I will say having a community and a coaching program like yours also helps us build confidence and validate, because I know as newer investors in the beginning, Brian and I thought we knew what we were doing and we would underwrite a deal, but we weren't sure. And when you have a community you can bounce it off of, that helps build your confidence, because you're like, I am on the right track. I am figuring this out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things that I wish I did sooner. Again, it's I wouldn't change anything about my past per se, because that's what brought me here. But I also know, and part of why I'm so passionate about offering this coaching is that I think someone could do what we did in far less time with far less stress and fewer mistakes with those tools, community of other investors and coaching. And I'll say this, you don't have to pay for an expensive coaching program. Like even just reaching out, reach out to me after this. I know you guys are very accessible. You can start conversations with people. We're all three of us here are podcast hosts. We have conversations with other investors. We're learning all the time. That doesn't cost a thing necessarily to go out and engage with other people, join Facebook groups, go to your local REIA meetups, or you guys host a breakfast, engage and just get out there and have conversations. And then of course, coaching is the next level. If you want to really dedicate yourself and be more deliberate and methodical about the path you're taking, then that's where a coach really comes in. But you don't need to drop a ton of money to access a lot of the benefits of having a community.
Yeah, I think spot on, Aaron. The whole idea of community, I think it was probably episode 2 that Anna and I talked about, and how much we've learned in the last 2 years just by talking to other investors and this podcast and being part of a meetup, that you're constantly having these conversations. I think Amna mentioned it's selfish the way that he wanted to do this, because he wants to have this conversation more often, and not everybody is real estate investors, so they don't understand. So once you're actually in these communities or hosting podcasts and talking to people like yourself, you're able to continue the conversation and continuously learning. So I know you mentioned your podcast, which is great. And it sounds like it ties into your coaching program a little bit about the hybrid real estate professional. And it's geared towards people that are working W-2 employees that are interested in learning about real estate and out-of-state investing. Is that why you started, just to continue sharing what you're learning?
Yeah, so I'll try and make this part quick, but basically I love writing and creating. And I think writing has been a big mental health tool for me too, especially coming out of the chapter with addiction and all that struggles. Journaling and just getting thoughts out of my head where they can get really easily scrambled. That has been a big benefit for me, not only for my own mental health, but also for just this coaching program was born out of me taking time to just kind of pull these little experiences out and put them on paper. And over time, so I started writing online every day in March of 2022. I took a writing accelerator program called Ship 30 for 30. The whole point of that program was to write 30 pieces of content in 30 days and publish them online. And I did that and I never stopped. I still haven't stopped. And what that did is it allowed me over time to get not only feedback on my ideas, because I was putting them on Twitter, and So I built a network. I started getting responses and having conversations, and it morphed into, at first I was writing about anything and everything, but then it became what is now the Hybrid Real Estate Professional podcast, where my writing started narrowing down into this: how did I create this portfolio of properties while working full time and while starting a family? That's the natural niche that evolved. And the concept of a hybrid real estate professional is someone who leverages the skills, knowledge, and income from one other chapter of their life, or maybe multiple other chapters of their life, and parlays it into being a real estate investor. So someone doesn't have to have a job, full-time job. They could be an artist. They could be a politician. They could be whatever the heck they want. It's about taking different experiences and transposing them into real estate, kind of like what I was explaining earlier with the concerts industry. I'm lucky and grateful that I have over 60 hours of content on that podcast over the last year plus. I've had some amazing conversations. We're going to have you on shortly. And just even by virtue of being able to have those conversations, I have grown a lot as an investor. And I know that there are people that listen to that show that have made comments that totally make my day, that they heard some useful nugget out of those conversations that has impacted their journey. I don't make money off the podcast. I spend money to produce it, but I know that's been an extreme, powerful accelerant on my own development. But it was born out of this love for creating content and just organizing my thoughts, and it evolved naturally. And then the coaching program was launched off the heels of that, right? Like, a lot of this stuff happened in order, but I wouldn't say that 3 years ago when I started writing online in 2022, I didn't know it was going to turn into a podcast. Didn't know it was going to turn into a coaching program. I just let this stuff play out organically and enjoyed the ride.
It's a great podcast for those of you who haven't heard it. It's the Hybrid Real Estate Professional podcast by Aaron. And we're going to ask a few final quick questions because I know we're getting short on time, but what is the best and what is the worst advice that you received? It doesn't have to be real estate related, but what would you say is the best?
So I was crippled with anxiety when I left the music industry because I thought that all these skills I had built as a concert promoter weren't going to map into any other profession. Like, it felt dealing with all these hothead egomaniac music industry people was too unique and that it wouldn't translate into a corporate environment. So when I was leaving the music industry, my boss at the time, when I told him I was leaving Vegas and I was going to go work for a different company, we had a nice conversation about just what this next chapter could look like. He gave me a piece of advice that I always remember. He said, when you're going into a new situation, especially when you don't know enough, if you're lacking context or if you're concerned about starting strong, he said, find the person who's in charge and find the person who gets shit done. 9 times out of 10, they're not the same person. But if you can identify those two people and understand the dynamic between the two, you're going to have figured out a big part of what you need to figure out in order to succeed at whatever that is. That's always stuck with me. I really like that. I think it applies to any industry, any context. It can apply at your local gas station or your Fortune 500 company. That dynamic exists everywhere. Sometimes it is the same person, but I think by identifying that and understanding it right out of the gate, you do give yourself an advantage. Worst piece of advice, I'm going to challenge the frame a little bit because I think advice by definition applies to different people in different ways. So I would say the worst advice for me, it would be the idea that a bigger deal right out of the gate will get you to your goals faster, because I believe in most situations, especially if you have family, especially if you have things to lose, a bigger deal comes with bigger risk. And in my situation with kids and a family that depends on me, I don't believe that taking that bigger risk fits my life. But that same advice could apply well to a 22-year-old that is motivated, hungry, and doesn't have a lot to lose. And if whatever they're betting big on doesn't pan out, they still have years and decades to recover. So I think it's the notion that you have to taking on a big, enormous deal right out of the gate to try and cut in line and get ahead of your financial goals. I challenge that advice. And I really just encourage people when they hear that stuff, which is prevalent on the internet, to put it in the context of their own life.
Yeah.
And don't just get sucked into the idea that, hey, all I got to do is take a big swing and I can cut 5 years off my financial trajectory. So I think those are my two.
Those are good ones.
Yeah, those are great. And looking back, so you've done a lot in a short time. What was the advice that you would give your younger self on what you've learned from today, Aaron, to when you initially began?
So I think there's a spectrum of a bias for action and an analysis paralysis. And some people are really good at taking action without necessarily break stuff and figure it out mentality.
Yeah.
And some people are very analytical and they might have sliced and diced data and decision-making matrices every which way, but they can't take action. And I think finding out how to exist somewhere towards the middle of that dial is going to ultimately be the best. But if you had to pick one in your younger age, I would say a bias for action is probably going to serve you better than over analyzing the hell out of everything. I made a lot of mistakes, many of which were avoidable, but there's zero arguing that by entering the game and learning those mistakes early and doing them, like I said, coming off that worst advice thing, I made my mistakes on stuff that I could have recovered from had it gone wrong. I believe that bias for action is what led me to be able to continue to evolve and grow versus if you stay on the sidelines and you are waiting for the perfect situation to emerge. Even if you're smart and you are being calculated, that can go too far. And if you stay on the sideline and you can't make a decision, then you're never going to get started. And if you never get started, you can never grow.
Imperfect action. Well, I'm right there with you. You chatted a little bit about this earlier, not scaling really big in the beginning stages. I see you have the small and mighty investor right behind you with Coach Carson. Anna and I are big avid readers. What are 3 books, they don't have to be real estate or business related, that you would recommend to our audience?
Well, I have to include The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor on that list. There's a reason that these are on my shelf. So actually, I'll use those 2 and then I'll add one more to the mix. So The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, Coach Carson, I'm very grateful to have followed his philosophy. I think coming across his books and joining his community when I did, we bought those 8 houses in a pretty short amount of time. And I think his philosophy entering our lives when it did allowed me to challenge some of the assumptions of how we were building. And it's made an incredible impact on what do we really need to hit our goals? And do we really need to keep growing, or can we make the most out of what we already have? So that's an incredible book, an incredible philosophy. Highly recommend to any investor of any size. And even if you are inclined towards growth, use it as a counterpoint so that you at least have the perspective of that's not the only way. Growing isn't the only way. The Psychology of Money is an amazing book by Morgan Housel. It's called The Psychology of Money, but it's more about psychology than it is about money. He's a great storyteller, and there's a lot of different illustrations of how people's perception of wealth is very different than the reality of wealth. And so I think there's a lot of great ideas in there and pieces of perspective that have informed my relationship with money. I think anybody at pretty much any age can get a lot out of that book. And then there's another one, you can't see it, it's on my shelf. It's called Essentialism. I am not a good example of this, but essentialism is a similar philosophy to The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor, but basically challenges the notion that doing more is better. And if you can get down to the essential few things that really move the needle in your life and continue to eliminate instead of add, that typically that will put you in a more focused, calm demeanor and achieve better results over time. So they're all nonfiction. I don't read a ton of fiction these days. I am a self-help, personal finance, real estate junkie. But yeah, those 3, I would say anybody can get value from.
I love a good book recommendation. So I think we're near the end. So I guess the last question we normally ask is, how can we help you grow your business?
Well, you guys are putting on an amazing show. I think the sharing how important it is to find agents who really understand the investor journey is a message that I continue to impress upon the people that I'm coaching now. I think the 3 of us are already in a community together. We already support and engage each other. So I appreciate you sharing your platform with me and allowing me to talk about my coaching program. If anybody's interested in that, I'd love to be able to share where they can find me. And I love having conversations with investors and especially people that are at the beginning. Like I mentioned, a couple of those friction points that people usually hit. Nothing makes me happier than helping people get past that analysis paralysis and into the game. Because I think once you start playing, it just opens into this whole beautiful thing. And the more that the 3 of us can collectively help others do that, I think that will be the best service we can provide.
Awesome. Yeah. So go ahead, share. If people are interested in talking to you or learning about your coaching program, how can they find you?
Sure. The easiest place to find everything is aaron.com. That's ARONAMEN.com. I've got a bunch of freebies in there. I've got an email course on the biggest mistakes I made. I've got a breakdown with the storytelling of my entire portfolio, including the numbers and the story behind it. And I have an interview pack for investors who want to build their out-of-state investing team. The second thing I'll share real quick is I mentioned the 20-minute investor. is Nathan and I did a free workshop where we basically gave away our workflows for how we manage our businesses in 20 minutes a day. So that's at 20minuteinvestor.com. That's 20minuteinvestor.com. So plenty of free stuff there, and you'll find ways to contact me on my website as well.
Awesome. Nico will put it in the show notes. I'll make sure.
We'll make sure to put it in the show notes, and definitely reach out to Aaron through his website or through social media if you are at all interested in this coaching program. And the podcast is called the Hybrid Real Estate Professional Podcast. We highly encourage that, and I will be on it shortly. So definitely stay tuned. But that's going to conclude our episode today of the Agent to Investor Podcast. If you found any value, please share, subscribe, give us some feedback on any episodes you'd like us to discuss, any topic. You can find me, Nico Garcia, and Garcia Official on all social platforms. And you can find Anna
on Instagram as Anna _realtor, or just Anna Bialek, pretty much anywhere else.
Awesome. And we want to thank Aaron again for coming on and sharing his story. This has been really fun. And until the next episode, thanks so much.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.